Do you love shows like Criminal Minds and Mindhunter? Are you interested in what it's really like for the agents that break down the psychology of violent offenders, serial killers, and sexual predators? If the answer is yes, you'll love The Consult, Real FBI Profilers. I'm Julia Cowley. I spent 22 years in the FBI and was assigned to the renowned Behavioral Analysis Unit. Join me, along with my colleagues, retired FBI profilers Angela Surser, Susan Kostler-Drew, and Bob Drew, as we look at some of the most notorious cases that have ever come into the Bureau. We'll take you inside the tape and into our thought processes as we analyze the behaviors, motives, and methods of criminals like JonBenet Ramsey's killer, serial killers like Israel Keyes and Joe DeAngelo, and we'll examine some of the most perplexing cases, such as the murder of Washington, D.C. attorney Robert Wone. It's more than just a podcast. It's a real-world look at how the FBI uses criminal psychology to assist law enforcement in our mutual quest for justice. Join our brand new Patreon for early and ad-free episodes and listen to The Consult Real FBI Profilers, available wherever you listen to podcasts.
The Murder Shelf Book Club contains disturbing content related to real-life crimes. Listener discretion is advised.
Standing in the location where a victim has been killed inevitably reveals new insights and details about the crime. We were confident we'd learn something new about the location that we couldn't ascertain simply by studying maps or overhead imagery. Additionally, when one is on site at a crime scene, it is possible to utilize all the senses. Sometimes a smell or a sound may provide a critical clue. George, Jared, and Jennifer Bucholtz. Silent Silhouette. Who Killed Deborah Sue? Welcome to the Murder Shelf Book Club podcast. I am your host, Jill. Well, it is cold, so please keep bundled up. This is episode 109, A Shower of Troubles, part 2 on Silent Silhouette, Who Killed Deborah Sue, by George, Jared, and Jennifer Bucholtz. Spoiler alert. All right, as we learned in part 1, episode 108, which you really need to listen to before this episode, we were in Lubbock, Texas, August 24th, 1975, and we met a young newlywed couple, Debbie and Doug Williamson, 10 weeks into their new marriage. Doug was at work at the Pizza Inn and was waiting for Debbie to arrive to help out that night, but she didn't show up. On a landline, Doug had called several times without her answering the phone. So around 1 a.m., Doug left to go check on her. They lived about 5 minutes away and went home, discovering his wife in a pool of blood in the carport of their home. Racing back to the Pizza Inn, Doug called the police, utterly panicked, and the investigation began immediately. But 46 years later, the case remains ice cold. No one has been arrested for Debbie's murder. Well, enter journalist George Jared and American Military University professor Jennifer Bucholtz, fresh off helping to solve the 2004 Rebecca Gould murder, determined to use what they'd learned previously to reinvigorate and reinvestigate Debbie's case. They enlisted the support and help of Debbie's family, all heading to Lubbock, Texas. Liz, Debbie's sister, and stepsister Paula would focus on their scheduled meetings with the Lubbock Police Department. Now, for the past 4 years, Liz and Paula had met with the detective on the case. But this trip, they felt empowered by the commitment and passion of George and Jennifer. They would not accept the same old lip service that they'd received previously. it was time to scoot Debbie's case to the top of the priority list. But first, George, Jennifer, Liz, and Paula would all visit Debbie's grave at Rest Haven Cemetery. They brought flowers with them, and Liz and Paula spruced up Debbie's memorial marker. And with the flowers, it added a loving touch to Debbie's final resting place. After a prayer, they made a promise that they would exhaust every avenue to solve this case for Debbie and the family. Of this emotion-laden visit, George writes, quote, "Visiting the final resting place of a murder victim is always a poignant moment. One cannot ignore the reality that the person should be alive and well, but someone decided to rob them of that right." End quote. And over the years, the pain may recede, but the heartbreak lingers, and it's just so unnecessary. Why? Why did this happen? Now, in this case, Debbie's murder appears likely to be the result of a misunderstanding or an overreaction to some perceived offense. And this realization made George and Jennifer angry, as I am. It's just so senseless. The sisters then headed off to the Lubbock Police Station, while George and Jennifer would connect with a few media outlets, and then they would start down the list of Debbie and Doug's friends that they needed to see. The most significant stop of this day would be going to Doug and Debbie's home, wanting to see it during the day and then again at night, at the time that the attack had taken place, approximately 9:30 p.m., walking in the shoes of the victim and the killer, seeing what Debbie and the killer would have seen themselves. First stop was at the Avalanche Journal, nicknamed AJ by the locals, the leading newspaper in Lubbock. They had covered Debbie's homicide in detail for months afterwards. Jennifer Bucholtz tried to get in touch with their stop crime reporter, but had no luck. So they decided on some serendipity. They would drop by the newsroom and see if someone would see them, or hear them, or pay attention to them. And no, that didn't work out either. Every door was locked. Phones also rang endlessly unanswered. All too common during the COVID pandemic. Now George and Jennifer headed over to the former Williamson house on 82nd Street. Immediately, they both realized that the crime scene was far smaller than they had expected after studying the crime scene photos. The carport was just barely wide enough for two vehicles, and even then it would be cramped. The space where the attack on Debbie occurred was just as tight, just a couple feet wide, say about half a meter. The police reports put the distance from the attack location in the carport to the back steps heading into the house at about 25 feet or 7.5 meters. Avenue L runs directly to the west side of the property, providing access to the carport, but it is very narrow with virtually no traffic. An unpaved alley borders the southern side of the backyard, barely wide enough for one vehicle to pass at a time. And the only vehicle that regularly traveled the alley was the garbage truck. Now, standing in the alley, you can look over a wooden fence into their backyard. And George had to wonder if this was exactly what the killer had done. He and Jennifer knocked on the front door, and no one was home, so they were limited to observing from the street. But they would be back. Now they headed over to the news station, KCBD, meeting with reporter Blair Sobel, who was very interested in Debbie's story, and this interview would air tomorrow. So another box was checked. After running several more errands, George and Jennifer regrouped, getting back with Liz and Paula, having dinner with them as they shared what they'd learned from speaking with the detective. With a lack of enthusiasm, the sisters described the setting. The Lubbock detective had brought a woman from the forensics lab who touted a large binder with her. And the women soon realized that the detective barely understood any of the case details after a year of being assigned to the case. The forensic expert, she wouldn't allow the women to view the folder, which makes one wonder, did it have anything inside that actually had anything to do with Debbie's case? Was this just pure smoke and mirrors? I mean, and honestly, who has file binders in the 21st century? Everything's digitized, isn't it? Well, 50 years after Debbie's murder, the Lubbock Police Department did not have a cold case unit and was still facing crazy homicide rates. Thus, their current cases were prioritized over those from the past. Well, check out everything you're told. I researched the FBI database and the Texas Department of Public Safety, looking up the homicide rate in Lubbock, and it did increase significantly from 2020 to 2021. So they were truthful about this. Always, always verify such statements yourself, or you can let me do it for you. Now, I had to think that perhaps there should be a cold case task force consisting of 2, 3, or 4 law enforcement agencies to help out jurisdictions that lack the resources to fund one themselves. Just a thought. Now, the Texas Rangers, they do have a cold case unit. However, from their website, they have no record of Deborah Sue Williamson. Well, Liz and Paula came away believing that the Lubbock Police Department believed Ricky was the killer, and since he was no longer living, having committed suicide in 1990, there was little point in pursuing the case. But that is wrong. I believe every victim, every family deserves to know what happened, and George and Jennifer strongly concur. And they weren't giving up, because tomorrow was the meeting with the Homicide Division Supervisor. That evening, approximately 9:20 p.m., George and Jennifer arrived at what had been the Williamson home in 1975. The murder was estimated to have occurred at 9:30, so this was a very accurate scenario for conditions the night of the murder. Oddly, the sheriff's vehicles began driving up and down the nearby streets, shining a spotlight. Was it harassment? A deterrence? Curiosity? It also made George think he needed to ask an officer if they happened to check this area on the anniversary of her death every year, because it is not unheard of for a killer to return to the scene of a crime. This is really not a cliche, and some have been arrested and brought to justice due to this. While George walked the alley on the south side, a public road, and reaching Avenue L, a deputy pulled up alongside them. He claimed to have received a report about a one-armed homeless man wandering the neighborhood. Had anyone seen a person matching that description? A one-armed man? Seriously? Had this guy grown up watching The Fugitive or what? Well, obviously this was a ruse to talk to them and to find out what was up, if he really didn't already know. And no one had seen a one-armed man. Well, this activity caught the attention of Juan, who was the current occupant of the house on 82nd. Somewhat awkward, they introduced themselves and explained why they were there that night, as Jennifer flipped on her GoPro camera, walking through the carport to speak with Juan. Learning of their quest to solve Debbie's murder, this decent, gracious man allowed them to come onto the property and even inside the residence. Juan had heard of the case, and he knew she had died here, and he was glad to help. Now, some takeaways from being on the site of the crime on the anniversary at the time it occurred. It was incredibly dark, in spite of illumination from the surrounding neighborhood and streets. With the lighting of the carport area unchanged from 1975, seeing into the carport or backyard was impossible, and a very accurate representation of conditions the night of the murder. Now, in 1975, this area was remote. There were a few houses with an empty field across the street. Eyes adjusting to the dark, you really couldn't discern objects in the backyard or the layout, and a stranger would have been vulnerable, not knowing where what was. Nor could a stranger tell if Debbie was alone that night or had a house full of guests. So there was no question in my mind that the killer knew the layout of the home and the yard. Doug and Debbie came and went through the utility room door, opening by the yard's back step. Now George and Jennifer realized, quote, the killer had dragged her body from a very dark site with little chance of discovery to the most well-lit location on the property. It was as if the killer wanted to put her on display. The placement of the body also nearly eliminated the chance of a stranger walking or driving by and seeing her." End quote. The only way she would be found was by someone who showed up and walked to the back door, virtually making it inevitable that Doug would be the one to find her. Now, was that the killer's intent? Well, it sounds viable to me. I'd say this was deliberate and calculated. Further, they checked to see what phase the moon was on August 24th, 1975. It was at 3 days past the full moon, with the moon rising at 9:40 p.m. Therefore, the moon would have been low in the sky, providing little light on the scene of the stabbing. Inside the house, they saw the configuration of the rooms had not changed since 1975, a huge plus. The utility room opened to the kitchen, and looking out the window over the sink, one could not see into the backyard. If Debbie's killer had waited outside for her, she would have been unaware of him. Now they did an experiment. George stood outside by the back door on the south side. Jennifer came out of the utility room onto the back step, as Debbie would have had to do to depart. Knowing that George was standing there, Jennifer still could not see him, being night blind. The pupils of the eyes were still contracted from being in the lighted kitchen. Only the eyes of the killer would be wide open and alert and having a strategic advantage. Thanking Juan profusely for his cooperation, they got into their car parked along Avenue L to discuss what they'd learned, seen, and concluded. An hour later, only 2 cars had driven by. The very definition of remote then, and 46 years later, still true. So I absolutely believe that this is a calculated murder by someone who knew Doug and Debbie's habits and the layout of that home. There's just no way around it. A new phase of the investigation began for George and Jennifer after the night of walking over what felt like hallowed ground. They met a witness that they hoped would provide vital insights into the homicide. Tina McBride, Paul Neal's date that night. After enjoying the peace and quiet of a drive surrounded by beautiful clay and brown vistas, tumbleweeds, mountains, and desert, they arrived at an isolated shanty decorated with gleaming white animal skulls located next to a man-made lake. Okay, this gave George pause. Nevertheless, they pressed onward, knocking on the door. A man answered, and they explained that they were hoping to speak with Tina. The silent doorman pointed a craggy finger towards the trail and another house just barely visible in the distance. Thanking him, they went off to find Tina. At the end of the trail was a beautiful home complete with friendly dogs. Tina was inside making lunch, and before they uttered a single word, Tina said, quote, "Deborah Sue Williamson, how did I know that was going to come up? I saw you on the news yesterday and said, I bet you that comes up," end quote. Well, spot on Tina McBride. They quickly began discussing the role Tina had played in the events surrounding the murder. She recalled many details, and she seemed forthright. Working part-time at Pizza Inn, Tina had known Debbie. She and Paul had spent some time together, but weren't exactly boyfriend and girlfriend. Tina told them that Paul called her around 9:30 p.m., saying he was just leaving work. He had arrived like 9:50 p.m., but the detective who took her statement wrote down 10 p.m. instead. But wait a second. Paul called her at 9:30 p.m. saying he was leaving work? Well, that's not true. We know this is not true. Paul clocked out at 8:43 p.m. So why did he lie to her on the phone? Well, later, Tina was told that this timing just did not work, that there was no way Paul could have left work at 9:30, driven to his parents' home, showered, dressed, and arrived to pick her up at 9:50, just 20 minutes later. The Lubbock Police Department had actually tested this, and it took a minimum of 30 minutes. Pressed by George, he sought to have Tina confirm that Paul said he was leaving the Pizza Inn, and Tina was unwavering, and it still bothered Tina that Paul had been late that night. Tina pointed out he could have told her he was at work, but then been at his parents' or somewhere else. Paul drove a small, older car, and I do wonder about the kind of tires that were on it, but Tina couldn't eke out any more details from a 50-year-old memory. How did Paul act that night? Tina said he had just gotten out of the shower as his hair was wet, and, quote, he acted nervous in the darkness of that night. What are you looking at me like that for? End quote. She replied that she didn't know and that they were just going into town. Now, Tina assumed that they'd be going to the Pizza Inn because the next day she was heading off to start her freshman year at Texas A&M. So this was her last night to spend with her friends. But Paul insisted on going to McDonald's, where Tina had never worked and didn't know anybody. They had spent about 2 hours there, and then Paul took her home. After she had been at college a few weeks, she received a phone call from Billy Neal, Paul's father. They spoke in great detail about what she recalled from the night of August 24th, with Billy Neal recording their discussion, and that this was the first of several such conversations they had. All right, this is really weird to me. Why would your date's father call you asking about his son's behavior the night Debbie was killed, and on several occasions? Well, George wondered how Tina had known Billy Neal was recording the conversation, and she said simply, quote, he told me, end quote. What the heck is going on that he's recording conversations? And recognize and understand, Tina had never met Paul's dad before. They weren't close, they weren't friendly, making this all the more bizarre. George asked if Billy Neal was attempting to coach her about what she remembered that night. And Tina admitted that, yes, this was possible, that the elder Neal asked the same questions over and over, with her giving the same response. He seemed afraid that something would happen to Tina, which again is kind of bizarre, and he wanted to memorialize Paul's alibi. But I'm not convinced that Tina is Paul's alibi. Certainly not from 8:43 to 10 p.m. A few weeks later in September, Tina ran into Paul at a Texas A&M football game, and he was now skin and bones and looked haggard. He told her the police had interrogated him rather hard, saying that Paul was a suspect. Years later, she ran into him again, and he asked if he could call her, but Tina had a boyfriend and declined. Had Paul ever spoken to her about Debbie and their relationship? Oh, indeed he had. Paul was smitten with Debbie. After Debbie had broken it off, Paul seemed scorned, to use Tina's term. She told them that she had heard rumors over the years. One was that the killer had taken a shower at the house before he left. Another was that he went inside and had a drink. And after a few hours of conversation, George and Jennifer thanked Tina because getting a first-hand account from 50 years ago was very valuable. Heading back to Lubbock, they had another interview, this time with Philip Hamilton, a journalist who worked at the Lubbock Avalanche Journal in the 1980s. He had written about Henry Lee Lucas's false confessions. Enjoying dinner at a Mexican restaurant, Jennifer, Liz, Paula, and George listened to Philip Hamilton's recollections from the time, and he still had his contemporaneous notes from the time at the newspaper, plus a 28-page synopsis of a book he toyed with writing. Well, incredible, what a boon. Given access to all of this, they appreciated Hamilton's timeline derived from the Lemons' statements. A few gems gleaned from these notes. 1. The Buffalo Spring Lake trip the day prior to Debbie's murder. Doug had left early, and Debbie had stayed until about 5 p.m. 2. The night of Debbie's murder, Bob Lemons, her stepfather, legally blind, had jumped out of the car before Joyce had a chance to park, rushing past two officers, racing over to see Debbie, thinking she had been raped and was still alive. The news that she was dead was shocking to Joyce. And 3, Bob was allowed to enter the house, and he noted the wet towels in the bathroom thrown over the shower curtain to dry. Now, was this the origin of the rumors Tina mentioned that the killer had taken a shower cleaning up after stabbing Debbie? Well, one thing that Bob believed, the killer had remained at the home for several minutes. The kitchen window had been broken with the garden hose, and we established that it was smashed after the murder, a ruse of burglary. Newspaper coverage about this homicide was rather intense the first few weeks, and then sporadic afterwards. A decade later, Philip Hamilton covered Henry Lee Lucas's confessions of 3 murders in Lubbock. Now, as this story progressed, Hamilton realized that Lucas was lying as, quote, none of it fit, end quote. And no one could even prove that Lucas was in Lubbock in August 1975. Philip Hamilton was assisting Bob and Joyce Lemons to get the word out that Henry Lee Lucas had not killed Deborah Sue Williamson until his editor abruptly vetoed the story. Philip then went to another news outlet, which he could legally do, but he was flat out fired as a result. Bob and Joyce invited him to move in so that he could work on his book. Later, when Philip's father became ill, he left the Lemons' home. Nostalgically, Philip recalls the warm bond that was struck up between him and the grieving but determined parents. Hamilton continued to work the case, being supportive of the Lemons, who vented about the lack of quality police investigation. Many officers had trampled through the crime scene, and the mold of the tire print cracking apart, and it just drove Bob crazy. Years would go by with no new developments, with the police dropping the ball. The embarrassment over the Lucas fiasco made them wish the whole case would be forgotten. Bob Lemons passed away in 1994 and Joyce in 2019, not long after her participation in the Confession Killer Netflix documentary. Over the years, Philip continued to keep in touch with Liz. Well, their dinner wound up and everyone would be parting in good humor, and George and Jennifer would begin the next round of interviews, what would bring answers, but also more questions. Next up, the appointment with the Lubbock Police Department Homicide Division Supervisor. And George opted out. This was actually a smart move. First, he was concerned that the supervisor might cancel if he knew anyone other than Debbie's sisters would be in attendance. Second, in some situations, and certainly not all, law enforcement and the media are antagonistic. George has had many good, productive relationships with police, but sometimes it could go south, undermining any cooperation and productivity, diminishing potential positive outcomes. Solving Debbie's murder case had to be the priority. Jennifer wasn't thrilled with George's change of mind because they had a plan and they should stick to it. And he heard her and he understood her. They were a team and they were supportive of each other and they were determined to get answers. But George knew that this was the right move. He advised Jennifer to stress her military background, her professorship with American Military University, and professionalism. By the way, this had not come up when investigating the previous Rebecca Gould case because those investigators had refused to meet with them at all. Oof. And Jennifer went off to meet with him as George began his mental pacing. Hours later, after speaking with the homicide supervisor, Sergeant Justin Anderson, Jennifer called George. While Sergeant Anderson wouldn't discuss specifics, he was willing to work with them to try to get new DNA testing on some select and key pieces of evidence. Anderson recognized there were times when outside investigators have more wiggle room than law enforcement. so this would be a win-win situation. The glass was half full. He encouraged them to share any new information or tips, and importantly, Sergeant Anderson kept his word. Later, Jennifer would be filling in Liz and Paula, who also felt uplifted and encouraged. Quote, "The department seemed ready to finally solve this case with our help," end quote. They all agreed that cooperating with the Lubbock Police Department was critical to solving this mystery. Who killed Deborah Sue? One thing they remained hung up on, though, speaking with Lex Brown, who had not returned any of Jennifer or George's phone calls. A few years back, Liz had spoken with Lex briefly, and he told her that he, quote, hoped she finds what she's looking for. He'd also told her he'd spent years trying to forget the whole murder, end quote. Well, I guess that's not some kind of crazy comment, but that seems like an odd thing to say. And this struck both George and Jennifer as well. His language choice there was just off. Normally, people respond with some phrasing hoping for justice or resolution to the case. That's not what he said. Now, Liz would opt to call Lex Brown, leaving a voicemail when there was no answer. She would also try a number that supposedly belonged to a female relative, with the call sent to voicemail after a single ring. Well, with this, their visit to Lubbock was winding down. Soon, Liz and Paula would head home, with Jennifer slated to drive back to Colorado shortly. She and George had one more visit to make, to Susan Godwin, the girl Doug had dated just before Debbie. Susan had been questioned by police back in 1975. She had denied any animosity towards Debbie. Arriving at Susan's home, her husband and two pet dogs greeted the investigative podcasters. Welcoming, they had seen George and Jennifer on the news the day before. See, media does matter. Unfortunately, though, Susan was out helping her sister, and she'd be gone for another few hours. While disappointed, they left their contact information, which he promised to pass on to Susan. Heading to their cars, Jennifer decided to get a jump on the drive home and was saying their goodbyes, affirming their commitment to get to the truth. And then the husband came out into the yard waving. Susan was on her way home and she wanted to speak to them. Could you wait a sec? Oh, the stars aligned. A few minutes later, Susan arrived home and they all settled in around the kitchen table. Susan was very open, saying she was a true crime fan and liked to delve into cases. She had learned of Debbie's murder a day or two after it occurred when she was a student at Texas Tech and was very shaken up. She and Doug had met at McDonald's and had dated for a year. They had gotten engaged, so this was quite serious, but broke up when Susan decided she wanted to attend college. She had thought that she and Doug might eventually marry if he hadn't married Debbie. Quote, I think he's a really great guy. He's really sweet. End quote. Not long afterward, Doug began dating Debbie, marrying a year later. Well, that's some new information. And no, Susan hadn't been invited to the wedding, and she would have declined had she been. Susan admitted having exchanged some jealous words with Debbie, but they hadn't had a fight or an altercation, and she had attended the funeral, extending condolences. Well, this matched her 1975 statements to detectives when she had declined any animosity towards Debbie. George and Jennifer asked her about other employees working in McDonald's, and then about the missing wedding proofs. She told them what she could, and added that police had told her a friend of Doug's may have been jealous of Doug being with Debbie, but she couldn't recall his name. When they asked her about Doug, she dismissed any suggestion that he'd have hurt anyone, let alone Debbie, and he loved Debbie. Over the years, Susan had thought it was likely Ricky who had killed Debbie, and she certainly isn't the only one. She had also heard that the killer was transient and had randomly come through town, met up with Debbie, and killed her. And Susan prayed that the case would be resolved. Quote, My heart goes out to her family and everyone involved. There's no way I could do anything to hurt Debbie, end quote. Thanking Susan for her candor and her cooperation, George and Jennifer departed. They concluded that while Susan definitely cared a great deal about Doug, and there had been some angst between her and Debbie, nothing pointed to Susan as a crazy, jealous ex. Getting back into their cars, Jennifer would head home, while George had another destination in his sights. Doug's best man, Lennis Terry, wanted to meet with George. Lennis and his wife, Rhonda, were warm, friendly, and very eager, hoping to contribute something that led to the resolution of the case. Lennis explained that his friendship with Doug, dating back to them as little kids playing cop and robber and watching cartoons. After graduating high school, they had shared an apartment, bowled together, and loved working under the car hood. Lennis and Rhonda married a year before Debbie and Doug. At that time, Lennis had a lot on his plate, being newlywed, taking college courses, and working, so he didn't know Debbie well. Hearing of her murder, he and Rhonda went into shock. Doug had actually lived with them for a few weeks immediately following, Lennis told them. He just couldn't go back to his house. The night before the funeral, Doug asked the Terrys to go to the house and get the wedding photos. It was like 11 p.m. and no one wanted to go. So Lennis, Paul, and Lex all went, stopping to get a police officer to accompany them. They looked high and low, realizing the wedding album was missing. Deliberately stolen or inadvertently taken when the killer stole Debbie's purse? Questions remain. Now, Lennis had spent a lot of time with Doug in his house growing up. He had to have been there over 100 times. And he saw that night that the house was immaculate, again confirming that no struggle had taken place within the dwelling. Lennis did not know Lex very well, and he was not aware that Paul and Debbie had dated in the past. Further, he and Rhonda didn't understand why Paul became a primary suspect. They just didn't believe that Paul could be involved. They just knew Paul as a guy who loved to ride his small motorcycle. Like many others, Lennis and Rhonda had heard Ricky was responsible, and later that it was Henry Lee Lucas who had killed her. The Terrys had tried to keep in touch with Doug after he moved to Arkansas and started college, and they honored Doug by giving their son, Landon, Douglas as a middle name. They had all last been together at Landon's wedding. Was there anything else that George and Jennifer should look into? The Terrys paused and apologized, not being able to come up with anything. And in the morning, George would return home. Oddly, though, the police had never contacted Lennis for an interview in 1975. The man was Doug's best friend, had history with Doug, knew the house, knew Debbie slightly, and many of the others involved, but there'd been no interview. That's just odd. It just is. It's just odd. And note, odd is happening a lot in this case. Now, I'm going to digress for a moment because one other thing did come up during the conversation with the Terrys. Lennis and Rhonda's son, Landon Douglas Terry, was murdered on December 22nd, 2017 at age 38. And I just had to go and find out what happened. After reading a dozen articles from the Lubbock Avalanche Journal, Landon Terry, divorced father of 3, had come over to friend Andrea Turning's home, bringing her coffee, when he was ambushed by 42-year-old Casey Owens, a jealous ex of Andrea's. She had broken off with Owens due to his meth addiction. Moving on with her life, she and Landon connected on Facebook and had only met in person 2 weeks before his murder. The night before, they had dined at Landon's home and made the morning coffee plans. And there's evidence that Casey Owens had been stalking and threatening Andrea. That morning, he broke into Andrea's home, waving a gun, striking her, forcing her into the bedroom. And that was when the doorbell rang. Owens answered the door, shooting Landon Terry. Rushed to the University Medical Center, Landon Terry died of his wounds. The Owens trial was delayed due to the COVID pandemic, but in January 2022, Owens pled guilty. While he could have been sentenced to 99 years, due to the plea deal, he was sentenced to 40. What a damn shame. That is just heartbreaking. Michelle Terry, Landon's ex-wife, spoke at sentencing saying, quote, "We are forced to live hurting forever, knowing we will never be the same. I have missed Landon every day since you took him from us, and I will live the rest of my life missing him, and so will my boys, and it's your fault. You destroyed so many lives in a matter of minutes, and I hope it weighs heavily on you for the rest of your life. It's clear Landon's life meant nothing to you, but he meant everything to me and my boys." End quote. Landon's son, Cannon, was 7 years old when his father died. At 11 years old, with his two brothers standing with him, arms crossed on his shoulders, Cannon read his impact statement. Quote, "I hope every night you remember what you did to us. You hurt me in the worst possible way, and I hope you are filled with regret. The man you took away from me was priceless. He was the most amazing dad, and you took him away from me for the rest of my life." End quote. Caden Terry, who was 12 when his father was killed, said that the last 4 years had been like, quote, "having to live with a part of your heart missing." End quote. The eldest son, Colton Terry, recounted the day he learned he would never see his father again. Quote, "The raw confusion and fear that I felt that day relives in my brain every day, and I hope you live with the guilt and regret all your life. You have forever ruined my life and the lives of everyone who knew and loved my dad." End quote. Andrea Turning also spoke, saying, quote, "Even though I try to focus on the fact that Landon was my hero that day, it is not lost on me that he was the true victim. I wish he hadn't shown up when he did. I wish I could go back to that day, and the one thing I would change would be that he didn't choose to bring me coffee. A simple, friendly gesture changed the course of so many lives." End quote. Now, if I had not read Silent Silhouette, I would have remained completely unaware of this case and what happened to Landon Douglas Terry. Clearly a beloved man, son, father who was taken way too soon. So I want to remember Landon Terry for a moment and think of his sons and his loved ones. And I'm glad there was justice, even though Lennis would tell George of his son's death, quote, "There's no such thing as closure. You just get to the point where you can function." End quote. Something Doug, Joyce, Bob, Liz, and Paula all understand. The next step in Debbie's case, with research, interviews, on-site investigation, recordings, photographs, some case files. Next was studying the behavioral aspects of the case and creating a profile of the person who killed Deborah Sue Williamson. After intense, focused analysis, Jennifer and George identified a number of clues that the killer left behind. Founding father of criminal behavioral profiling, John Douglas's words came back to me. "To understand the artist, you must look at the art." On this, Silent Silhouette reads, quote, "Identifying the behavior clues provides valuable insight into the psychology, personality, and motive of the murderer." End quote. And we are entering my favorite part of the book. All right, a killer's behavior falls into two categories: the modus operandi and signature. And I've spoken about both of these aspects ad nauseum, but to briefly review. The MO are the actions taken to commit the crime. This includes factors such as stalking the victim, wearing a mask, bringing a weapon to the scene, planning an escape route. In this case, we know the killer brought a knife to the house and likely unscrewed the light bulb by the back door to conceal his presence. Afterward, he broke the kitchen window with the garden hose, staging the burglary, which failed to convince anyone, finding glass on top of the blood, meaning it happened after the murder and not before. A signature is composed of behavior that is unnecessary to commit the crime, revealing a psychological need, mindset, and the personality of the killer. This perpetrator attacked, then moved the body, dragging it to a second location, completely unnecessarily, removing her clothes, leaving her exposed, and stealing her purse. None of these was necessary to the action of killing Debbie. All of these occurring after her death, because the killer needed to do this for his psychological satisfaction. Was this murder premeditated or a reckless impulse-driven event? Well, what say you, murder bookies? Because there are clues. No knives were missing from the Williamson home, so the killer brought one with him with the intent to use it. That is premeditation. Tire tracks were found and photographed in the alley to the south. While we cannot be absolutely certain, everyone living in the area asserted that the only vehicle going up that alley was that garbage truck. So these tire prints are likely the killer's, made by a small sedan-type car. Now, if I were carrying my knife to the scene of my upcoming murder, I sure wouldn't park in front of the house. I'd park it way out somewhere, get away in the dark, where others rarely travel, like the alley, so I could sneak in, kill her, and then sneak back. And this is likely what happened. And it means the knife-carrying driver was being sneaky and deliberately evading detection. The attack. A possible scenario is that Debbie's killer lurked outside, attacking her the moment she came out of the house and onto the back step. She never closed the kitchen door, only the storm door was shut. It's also possible that he had come up with some ruse to gain entry, planning to attack her inside. But she surprised him, exiting the house with keys and purse in hand. Whatever might have actually happened, this was planned out in advance. Another way of analyzing a crime scene includes another broad category: organized or disorganized murder scene. Now think of this as a spectrum where factors fall along this continuum. Rarely is a murder 100% organized or 100% disorganized. Most perpetrators exhibit a range of behavior, hence a mixed designation. But generally, traits will tip towards one end or the other. Now, the murder in this carport was chaotic. The killer thought he was in control. In the dark environment, he removed the light bulb, shrouding himself within the shadows, his pupils adjusting accordingly. Debbie comes outside, heading back to the Pizza Inn, and then someone is there attacking, pain, perplexed, shocked. She begins to defend, struggling perhaps more than was expected. George believes this points to a disorganized attack. While silent, a knife is a very messy weapon, and it creates a very bloody crime scene. The more blood, the more the likelihood of the killer getting blood on himself. So this is not a sophisticated criminal mastermind at work. Had the killer cleaned himself up after the murder? Well, I would surmise he had to, with blood spatter on him, because there are problems if he does not. Getting back into your car when covered with the victim's blood will transfer blood to the car, making a greater mess and more evidence. Now the car has to be cleaned up, with the cleaning materials becoming more evidence needing disposal. So it is not a stretch to deduce that the killer got blood on his shirt, probably his pants and shoes. If he were organized, did he bring a change of clothes with him? Oh, I believe he did, and he planned that out. Even so, what remains is a bunch of bloody clothes. So he absolutely had some kind of plan about cleaning this up and getting rid of the bloody clothes, because he knew exactly what he was going to do about this. I believe he did go inside and take a shower, leaving the wet towels draped over the shower curtains that were mentioned by Bob Lemons when he went through his daughter's home. Normally, a killer strikes and flees quickly, taking the murder weapon. Well, this killer takes the weapon, but he takes on increased risk, remaining at the crime scene long enough to drag Debbie's body and stage this as a sexual assault. He then takes the garden home and breaks the window. These actions reveal the killer's mindset. He is confident. He is determined. These acts were important enough to accept greater risk of discovery because he knew the house, the occupants, their schedules, and who would be where that night. He knew Doug would not be interrupting him. So, staging 101. Why do criminals stage a scene? Well, principally, staging takes place for two reasons: to direct the investigation away from the most logical suspect, or to protect someone, perhaps a victim or a family member. Now, the first, redirecting the case away from the killer, that is what's relevant here. Staging to look like a sexual assault, this basically rules out sexual assault as the motivation. But it does not rule out it being a sexually symbolic crime. A knife can be interpreted as a phallic symbol, which is thrust into the target. So psychologically, the knife may have been substituted for the sex act itself. Killers often attempt to redirect the investigation because they have some kind of association or relationship with the victim. Further, research tells us, and this is critical, that if the offender has a close relationship with the victim, he will only partially remove the victim's clothing, never leaving her completely nude. Bingo! This is exactly what happened here. So I conclude that this killer is a male who knows Debbie. By the way, George points out, it is not easy to get blue jeans off a dead body. This takes a lot of effort and determination by the killer. Now, after a murder, given the stress and concern about being caught as one is staging the crime scene, perpetrators will make mistakes. They don't have the time or the mental capacity to consider and connect all the dots. So things slip by, and forensics can reveal inconsistencies, which exposes the staging. Research also tells us that in the aftermath, this kind of perpetrator who is manipulating can behave a bit too cooperatively, is too eager to help catch a killer, or may be overly distraught, simply grieving too much to have had anything to do with this terrible crime. And one more tidbit about the research. Disorganized killers do not stage crime scenes. They're just too irrational and too erratic. While this guy has some disorganized characteristics, such as living close to the crime scene, attacking in a blitz pattern, he is a planner. He chose a quiet weapon, a knife. He did his homework. He learned Debbie's and Doug's schedules. He ensured that Doug would find her body, not someone accidentally stumbling upon a crime scene. I also do not believe he is killed before. It is very likely that this killer had a grudge, exposing Debbie to humiliate her, seeking some retribution for some perceived embarrassment that the killer just can't let go of. As he knows the chances are high that Doug is going to find his wife's body, it may also have been important to taunt him. Quote, "Here lies the beautiful woman you married, but she's no longer yours because I took her away from you." End quote. As George and Jennifer discussed this, it occurred to her that Debbie had been found face up, with no attempt to cover her face at all. This is significant. Many times, when a killer and victim are familiar, the killer expresses remorse by covering the face or body to remove the emotional dissonance he feels, avoiding seeing the victim's dead stare right at him. Quote, "Psychologically, seeing the victim's face is difficult for most humans because they feel scrutiny from the victims, even in death, and the victim's face is a reminder of the crime that had just been committed." End quote. This guy has no remorse. He may have even enjoyed watching Debbie die, but in the dim illumination, how much of her face could he see? I think just enough to satisfy that. Just enough to make it out on that dark night. A question that George and Jennifer debated was, 17 stab wounds. Is that indicative of overkill? That is, inflicting more wounds necessary than to kill someone. Well, according to a 2022 study published in the Legal Medicine Journal, overkill occurs in approximately 14% of all homicides. In Debbie's case, several of the wounds inflicted would have been fatal by themselves without immediate medical intervention. But how had this sequence played out that night? Had it taken 17 wounds to subdue a resisting Debbie? Once subdued, did the killer stop attacking or continue? Often during knife attacks, the attack ceases when the knife blade breaks. Or had he injured himself and stopped? Or had he gotten spooked and fled? Again, there's really no specific evidence pointing to any one of these scenarios. And what fueled the anger that night? Well, I believe it built up over time, smoldering, teasing the killer's mind and thoughts, and that the decision was made to kill Debbie for whatever affront he believed occurred. What makes someone angry enough to stab someone 17 times? Well, the classic motivation list: money, sex, power, jealousy, and resentment. And I think we can rule out money, these being young newlyweds who didn't even own their own home yet. Sex, power, jealousy, resentment, well, perhaps all four. But whatever it is, it stems from a personal relationship. The majority of the stab wounds occurred in the upper torso region. There is an autopsy diagram on my blog which demonstrates this at www.murdershelfbookclub.com, December 2024. We know her lungs and right atrium were punctured, and that this is an act-focused killer. It is clear his intention was to subdue and kill her as quickly as possible. He did not toy with her and string this out. But George and Jennifer know that he did not slit her throat, which would have been the most expeditious method of causing death. Was the killer subconsciously unwilling to damage Debbie's face, hair, and good looks that perhaps he coveted? Would killing her this way from behind be just too remote? Had he wanted Debbie to know who he was and that he had control over her and that he was getting her back for whatever? After kicking around all these ideas and insights, George and Jennifer concluded that Debbie and her killer knew each other and had some kind of prior relationship, not necessarily a romantic one. 17 stab wounds, we're talking intense anger. Now, was this anger directed at Debbie, Doug, both Debbie and Doug? Well, we don't know, but it's certainly personal, like I said. Our author sought out several other profilers for their input, with them confirming Jennifer and George's conclusions. Had the killer returned to the crime scene that night? Well, it's certainly possible, as many people did go to the house. The police questioned many close friends and relatives. Now, from a killer's perspective, going back to the scene has certain bonuses: maintaining control over the situation, at least in his mind, and seeing what the police were doing at the scene. It also helps explain one's hair and fingerprints at the crime scene.
Well, of course I was there that night after Debbie was found.
And if anything incriminating was inadvertently left behind, it can also be explained away this way. Now we are looking at identifying DNA that the killer might have left behind. And if I were the killer, I would be gravely concerned, given the number of old cold cases being solved with DNA or genetic genealogy. It is also not uncommon for killers to insert themselves into an investigation. If he was known to Debbie, known to Doug, his presence was legitimate, and he could play hero. He would help find Debbie's killer, standing up since Doug was so shaken he couldn't even go back in the house. He had no qualms about going into the house before police, even going inside, because he knew the killer wasn't hiding in a closet and that the house was perfectly safe. As George and Jennifer compared notes, something occurred to them. What kind of scrutiny had the police given the other various suspects? Now, Ricky had likely been investigated the most thoroughly, resulting in no arrest. But what about everyone else? And they needed to find out. Following the playbook taken from their Rebecca Gould investigation, while in Lubbock, they hoped to engage as many people as possible. They also believed that a killer who has not been caught will be very interested in any renewed investigation, keeping tabs on this. If you recall, after the arrest of Rex Uerman, the alleged Long Island serial killer, a review of his computer searches revealed he had regularly looked for Gilgo, Lisk case, the name of victims, their families, doing just this, keeping tabs on the investigation. Thus, George and Jennifer wondered, could we lure Debbie's killer from the shadows into the light of scrutiny? Just prior to going to Lubbock, their new Facebook page launched, The Unsolved Murder of Deborah Sue Williamson. The local KCBD News reported on this, and very quickly, membership was up in the hundreds. And now everyone knows that the journalist and forensic scientists were in town. George offered to meet with anyone living in the area, hoping that their determination to solve this case would be apparent. And an added benefit of being accessible was making connections with other supportive local citizens. And he would continue to keep in touch with them for months upon months upon months, and still. Jennifer explains that the Facebook group is a terrific medium for connecting and sharing. Keeping members engaged and acknowledged is key, even for some less likely scenarios. Tracking every lead, every piece of information is time-consuming, but critically important. Everything needs to be confirmed or refuted. As Jennifer had done with Rebecca's case, she wrote a series of articles exploring different aspects of the murder, published on the American Military University site, or AMU-Edge. Links to some of these articles are also on my blog, so check them out. An amazing number of messages came forth, and not one went unanswered. These conversations resulted in greater insight into the case and deeper relationships. And from these, new connections were forged with reporters, lawyers, forensic experts, retired law enforcement, many willing to use their expertise to help. At the same time, George and Jennifer were in great demand from other podcasts, appearing as guests, speaking on Rebecca Gould's case. This resulted in them developing their own podcasts, Jennifer's Break the Case and George's Diamond State Murder Board. Between these podcasts and George's book, they kept Rebecca's case in the media until it was solved. Posting, discussing, listening, reading, Rebecca's killer, William Miller, was involved in this crowdsourcing, posting on the site, and messaging George and Jennifer. They further exposed the tunnel vision of an investigator on Rebecca's case, who was likely the one reason it had not advanced. His bias was so extreme, he turned down an offer by the Viaduct Society to assist. Now, Philadelphia's Viaduct Society is a world-renowned nonprofit organization of expert investigators, pathologists, criminal psychiatrists who offered their knowledge, skills, and experience to law enforcement free of charge. But this chief investigator on the Gould case wasn't going to turn over any case files to, quote, a bunch of civilians, end quote. And this officer was just plain wrong, hijacked by his own bias. Fortunately, this has not happened in Debbie's case. The Lubbock Police Department is very responsive, supportive, and welcoming any tips that George and Jennifer send. When they established a reward fund for information leading to the killer, the Lubbock Police Department pledged an additional $5,000 to it, a welcome surprise. The next step? Establishing a confidential email address where tips could be sent with the assurance that they would remain anonymous. Further, a billboard was posted in Melbourne, Arkansas, stirring the pot, creating conversation as the reward rose to $25,000. A single tip had led to the big break in the Gould case. William Miller was in town when Rebecca was murdered. Digging feverishly into this, George and Jennifer confirmed that indeed Miller had been in the area, and 6 weeks later, Miller was arrested. Now, utilizing crowdsourcing methods once more, results were happening. For example, an awesome Lubbock resident took upon himself to go to the city archives and provided an aerial photograph of the 1975 Debbie Williamson neighborhood, an invaluable testament to the remoteness of the area. Many old newspaper clippings were dug out of storage boxes and sent in. Facebook group members researched other murder cases that occurred in the 1970s, identifying factors that were similar to Debbie's case. Another cross-referenced the neighborhood addresses as they were in 1975 to help identify neighbors who were canvassed at the time, enabling them to be contacted today. Others went through old high school yearbooks seeking any information about Debbie. Property owner records, marriage certificates, criminal records, obituaries, absolutely anything that could be relevant were examined and posted, saving George and Jennifer hours upon hours of phone calls, writing to obtain records, and traveling back and forth to Texas. In 2020 came the invite to CrimeCon Austin, where George and Jennifer would give an hour-long presentation on their investigation into the Rebecca Gould case. They were honored and humbled when 1,000 people attended their session. I was not at CrimeCon Austin. I was remote that year, as I had to babysit that weekend, but I did watch their session. And so, the update. Arrested on November 7th, 2020, William Miller was extradited to Arkansas, was interrogated, polygraphed, and confessed. He underwent a number of competency exams. In Jennifer's article, she writes, quote, "On October 18th, 2022, nearly 2 years after his arrest, Miller appeared in the Izard County Jail courtroom and stood before Circuit Court Judge Tim Weaver. Miller was handcuffed in the front and clad in a protective vest and orange jumpsuit. His posture was slumped and his voice was soft, barely audible," end quote. When he pled guilty to the murder of Rebecca Gould, Judge Weaver sentenced him to 40 years, saying, quote, "I hope you serve every day of those 40 years. I won't be sitting here when you come up for parole, but if I was, I'd write a letter opposing it. In my opinion, you are remorseless and cold," end quote. And I have to think, if it were not for the efforts of George, Jared, and Jennifer Bucholtz, the Gould case may have lingered, staying cold and unsolved for years. Circling back, as the Miller case was progressing through the legal system, not long after that first trip to Lubbock, a former death investigator who worked with the local medical examiner contacted them, offering great insights into Debbie's autopsy, among other investigation tools. Another very exciting offer of assistance came from Ryan Russell, founder of a company called Open Door Genetics. Having heard of Debbie's case from Facebook, again, the importance of Facebook and social media, Ryan Russell offered his professional services in forensic genetic genealogy used to construct a family tree of an unknown DNA profile, should one be developed by the Lubbock Police at some point. They've committed to new DNA testing, and we all hope this modern look will lead to a suspect. And on this positive note, that is where I will wind down episode 109, A Shower of Troubles, on George, Jared, and Jennifer Bucholtz's silent silhouette, Who Killed Deborah Sue? With momentum building, In 2 weeks, episode 110, A Matter of Time, will drop part 3, second cast, as the investigation concludes with some startling disclosures bringing additional scrutiny to some important eyewitnesses. So do not miss the conclusion of Silent Silhouette. If you know anything that could be important to the case, please call Crime Line at 806-74-1000 or directly to the Lubbock Police Department at 806-775-2865. If this episode has stirred a long slumbering memory, a recollection of a conversation, anything that could be helpful, please reach out. I thank you for listening. I see you as you hear me. Meanwhile, share my podcast with friends and family and leave an awesome review after listening. You can now leave comments on Spotify. Hint, hint, hint. Thank you for being with me on our journey together into the cases, the updates, the analysis on the best true crime books out there. Join me or let me read for you. Share your thoughts with me at jill@murdershelfbookclub.com, on X, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, or join Patreon for $4 a month and help me select the next book to be featured. See you in 2 weeks.
Hey, I'm Kevin.
And I'm Jay from the KJ&A Podcast.
Join us each week where we discuss comics, movies, anime, video games, and current events.
Basically anything to make you laugh and have a good time with all the tangents.
You can find us on Twitter, X, Facebook, Instagram, Threads, Patreon, and all the things at KJ&A Podcast.
Gonna need to take it down a notch, about 20% there, Kevin.
And if you get that reference, you can be our friend.
Written and produced by Jill, all rights reserved. Music, The Pewter Elephant by Blue Dot Sessions.